In August 1991, a woman named Pam Reynolds lay perfectly still on an operating table in Phoenix, Arizona. Inside her brain, a blood vessel had ballooned to the point of bursting. The doctors had only one desperate option left: a hypothermic cardiac arrest. They lowered her body temperature to a freezing 60 degrees Fahrenheit. They taped her eyes completely shut. They plugged her ears with heavy speakers, blaring 100 decibel clicking sounds, as loud as a roaring subway train. And then, they stopped her heart. The blood was drained from her brain, no brain waves, no pulse. By every medical and legal definition known to humanity, Pam Reynolds was a corpse. But when the surgery was over and Pam was brought back to the world of the living, she didn't talk about a void of nothingness. Instead, she described the surgery, her own surgery. She perfectly described the exact shape of the pneumatic bone the surgeon used to cut open her skull, a tool kept hidden in a sterile package until after she was completely unconscious. She repeated the exact conversations the nurses had. She recalled hearing a female voice complaining that her veins were too small. She watched the entire procedure, floating near the ceiling of the operating room. Science tells us that consciousness lives in the brain. When the brain shuts down, the mind vanishes. So how do we explain Pam? And more importantly, why are millions of people around the world, from completely different cultures, returning from the dead with the exact same story? To understand what happens after our final breath, we have to look back to a dark experiment conducted over a century ago. The year was 1901. In Haverhill, Massachusetts, a physician named Dr. Duncan McDougall became dangerously obsessed with one question. If the human soul is real, does it take up physical space? And if it takes up space, can it be weighed? McDougall built a massive, highly sensitive industrial scale. He then placed the beds of terminal tuberculosis patients onto this scale. He sat in the dark, watching the needle, waiting for the exact moment life left their bodies. As the first patient took his final breath, the needle twitched. The weight of the bed suddenly dropped. Exactly 3/4 of an ounce, or 21 grams. The news shocked the world. The 21-gram theory became a global phenomenon. But McDougall's peers were not convinced. They argued the weight loss was simply a sudden release of moisture from the lungs and sweat from the skin. Desperate to prove his critics wrong, McDougall repeated the exact same experiment on 15 dogs. He waited in the shadows. He watched the needle. But when the dogs died, the scale didn't move, not even a fraction of an ounce. Instead of questioning his methods, McDougall made a chilling conclusion based purely on his own religious beliefs. He declared that animals do not have souls, and therefore only humans lose 21 grams of weight upon death. The scientific community banished his work. The mystery was buried for another 70 years. It wasn't until 1975 that a student at the University of Virginia, Raymond Moody, noticed something terrifying. While collecting data from patients who had flatlined and returned, he realized they weren't telling random drug-induced stories. Out of 150 cases, the blueprint of death was almost identical. First, the sound of the doctor declaring them dead. Second, a feeling of being pulled through a dark, suffocating tunnel. Third, standing outside their own physical bodies, watching the chaos of the emergency room from above. And finally, the light. A brilliant magnetic force that projects their entire life, every mistake, and every victory in a fraction of a second. This became known as the near-death experience. As decades passed, researchers discovered that this glitch in death wasn't limited to the West. Across the globe, people were experiencing the exact same phenomenon, but with bizarre cultural twists. Take the astonishing cases from India. In the 1990s, a man named Chaju succumbed to a severe fever. His relatives gathered, weeping, preparing for his final rites. Suddenly, his body jolted. Chaju woke up. But he wasn't disoriented, he was terrified. He claimed that after he died, 4 dark figures dragged him before a celestial court. There were clerks sitting behind massive desks, flipping through endless ledgers. One of the clerks looked at Chaju, then at his book, and shouted, "We don't want this man. You brought the wrong Chaju. Send him back." He was violently shoved backward and instantly woke up in his own bed. This could easily be dismissed as a fever dream, until you hear the story of Durga Jatav. Durga also flatlined after a prolonged battle with typhoid. Her family believed she was gone. When she miraculously took another breath, she told a story that defied all logic. She said she was taken to a similar court. When she tried to run away from her captors, they cut off her legs at the knees to prevent her escape. When she was brought before the head clerk, they checked her papers. Once again, a bureaucratic error in the afterlife. "Her name is not on the list," they said. "Take her back." Durga asked how she could return without her legs. They brought out several pairs of severed limbs, found hers, and reattached them, warning her not to bend her knees until they healed. Here is the chilling part. Days after Durga woke up in the hospital, her sister and a neighbor noticed something horrifying. Deep, unexplained scars had suddenly appeared directly across Durga's knees, right where she claimed her legs had been severed in the afterlife. Science does not accept religious ledgers or celestial courts. To the medical world, these stories are simply an impossible collection of anecdotes. According to a fundamental principle called the dependence thesis, every thought, every memory, and every emotion you have is entirely dependent on your brain. When the brain dies, the screen goes black forever. So how does science explain the tunnel, the light, the overwhelming feeling of peace? Psychologist Dr. Susan Blackmore proposes the dying brain hypothesis. According to her, the dark tunnel is nothing more than a mechanical failure of your visual cortex. The center of our vision has far more cells than the edges. When the brain runs out of oxygen, these cells begin to fire randomly and chaotically. The center stays bright, while the edges fade to black, creating the perfect illusion of a glowing tunnel. And that feeling of deep, divine peace? It is just a massive overdose of endorphins. As the body realizes it is undergoing catastrophic failure, it floods the system with natural painkillers. The life review, seeing your entire past flash before your eyes, is triggered by seizures in the temporal lobe, the exact place where your memories are stored. Science even has an explanation for the out-of-body experience. To prove it, researchers looked at fighter pilots. When a pilot performs an extreme maneuver, the gravitational force pulls all the blood away from their brain. They lose consciousness, a condition known as G-lock. In controlled experiments, volunteers were strapped into massive centrifuges and spun until they passed out from lack of oxygen to the brain. When they woke up, they described floating above their own bodies. They described the tunnel. They described the light. No one had died. No door to the afterlife had been opened. It was simply the machinery of the brain breaking down under extreme stress. So, case closed, right? The afterlife is just a hallucination, a biological coping mechanism for a dying organism. But, if it is all just a hallucination, how do we explain the things the dying brain somehow knows? In 2001, The Lancet, one of the most respected medical journals on Earth, published a massive study on near-death experiences. Out of 344 patients who were clinically dead and brought back via CPR, 18% reported vivid, hyper-realistic experiences. To test if people were actually floating above their bodies, Dr. Sam Parnia launched the AWARE study. In hospitals across the US and the UK, researchers placed hidden images on high shelves in emergency rooms. These images could only be seen if someone was literally floating near the ceiling. Over 4 years, thousands of patients suffered cardiac arrests. 101 survived and were interviewed. 2 patients had incredibly detailed memories of their rooms. But neither had been in a room with a hidden shelf. The results were inconclusive, which brings us right back to the crack in the wall of science. To Pam Reynolds, remember the conditions. Eyes taped shut, ears plugged with speakers emitting deafening noise, core temperature frozen, brain utterly completely drained of blood. The dying brain hypothesis says the visual cortex fires randomly as it loses oxygen. But Pam's brain had no oxygen and no electrical activity whatsoever. Yet, she knew the exact shape of a bone saw she had never seen. She knew the exact words spoken by the cardiovascular team. She even knew that the doctors had to hit her with the defibrillator twice to restart her heart, a detail the lead surgeon himself had actually forgotten until he checked the medical logs. Science can explain the light, it can explain the tunnel, it can explain the feeling of peace, but it cannot explain how a dead brain can hear, see, and remember the reality of the physical world. Perhaps the tunnel is just a biological glitch. Perhaps the afterlife is simply a beautiful lie our brains tell us to ease the pain of the end. But until someone crosses that final border and stays there, the ultimate truth remains hidden in the dark. And that one question remains the greatest mystery of human existence. What will you see when the screen finally goes black?